Welcome to Thursdays at the Museum. I'm Ian Rapnicki. I'm a Community Engagement Manager with the DIA. In today's tour, Picturing Music, we'll be taking a look at the DIA's collection through the lens of music. And if you like what you see today, strongly encourage you to come down to the DIA and visit in person. Just as a friendly reminder, residents of Macomb, Oakland, and Wayne counties all get unlimited general free admission, so come on down and see the art in person. During today's presentation, we'd love to hear from you. So if you want to share a comment or a question, you can leave a public comment if you're watching on Facebook, or if you're joining us on YouTube. Just make sure you're logged in first, and then you can leave a comment there as well. Those comments will be monitored by the DIA's Manager of Volunteer Development, Christine Mark. And now let's meet our presenters, volunteer docents Cindy Patrick, Frank Chen, and Jim O'Malley. There y'all are. How you doing?
You're doing well, Ian. Thank you.
Great. All right. I'm excited to learn some more.
Well, thank you, Ian. As Ian mentioned, I'm Jim O'Malley, and I want to welcome you to the Detroit Institute of Arts Thursdays at the Museum. As Ian mentioned, today's topic is Picturing Music, and it is one I hope you will find interesting and fun. What does music mean to you? Music has been around since the dawn of man. It started out with only the human voice, and then a simple drum and a few instruments. Some of those instruments we will be talking about today. Both music and art, the visual arts, are forms of communication that can transcend race, gender, nation, and language. They can lift people up and bring them great joy, as well as bring sadness. Music has always been an integral part of cultural traditions and rituals, as well as a method of socialization within our cultures. Although music is almost always associated with the sense of hearing, visual artists often use its subject matter, color, pattern, and more in ways to suggest sound. Today, we will be looking at the many ways in which music is depicted and heard through art. So without further ado, Cindy, would you mind telling us a little bit about music's earliest instrument, a drum?
Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to start today's presentation with, as you can see, it's titled Drum. It was made in the 1900s. We are not sure who the artist is, but it's from the Akan culture in what is today Ghana. That's in West Africa. It's made from wood and hide. And the Akan believe that trees possess spiritual properties. So I want to talk a little bit about the protocol for harvesting and the material that's used to create this drum before I get into the symbiology that's on the drum. So their belief system is that as living organisms, trees have souls just like humans. And when an Akan craftsman decides to cut down a tree, he has to take care in how he begins. There are very specific protocols for harvesting certain species of trees before they are felled, and rituals must be observed. It's not limited just to the wood and the carving of the wood, but it's also the spiritual aspects and the protocols cover the artisan's tools. Reason being to ward off any injury during sculpting. The tools that they use are an adze, awl, knives, planer, chisel, and spokeshave. And when I saw the word spokeshave, I was like, what the heck is a spokeshave? Well, if you think about the spokes of a wheel or the spokes of a spinning wheel, a spokeshave has two handles on it that you would grasp, and you would pull it down around a cylindrical object like a spoke. So it's a really small, very delicate kind of tool. So you can see, very complex creative process. So now we'll talk a little bit about our drum. The drum was once used as a musical instrument for special occasions in the Akan society. Its beats signaled the arrival of the king. Its imagery communicated important community proverbs. So the drum serves as what we call a mnemonic purpose. It aids in memory. The glyphs or the symbols on it help them read the story from the top to the bottom of the drum. It helped the folks recall proverbs, and some of these proverbs were also replicated on other objects like textiles, flags, and the royal regalia worn by community leaders. So let's take a look at our drum. And Jim, if you'll get out your trusty cursor. So I'm going to be talking about the register that's on the right side. It's a little bit dark in shadow. Unfortunately, we don't have a better photograph than this one, but at the very top, we have a crocodile. Thank you, Jim, right there. And the crocodile was a symbol for adaptability. Right beneath the crocodile, we have a bird, and it's kind of facing backwards. Its beak is back kind of toward its tail feathers. This is called a Sankofa, and that's not the name of the bird, that's the name of the symbol. And its meaning is to return and get it. Kind of means something like return to where you came from, remember where you came from, don't forget where you came from. Below that, all the way over to the right, yes, right in there. I don't think we can see it very well. There's a fern. The fern stands for endurance. And then at the very bottom, you can see there's kind of a square object. Yes, rectangular object. That represents a house, and that is a symbol for security. So as you can see, these motifs are symbolic language for the proverbs. They are used in the Akan royal court, and they tell stories about the beliefs valued in daily Akan community life. And with that, if we have any questions, Christine?
I don't think so. Why don't we move on?
Okay. So next we have a pair of rhythm instruments. You can see these are also from the early 20th century, and these are from the Sinufo culture. The Sinufo culture is kind of overlaps some of the region, which is today Ghana, but also covers the Ivory Coast, Mali, Burkina Faso. So a pretty big swath of land in Africa, kind of in that on the western part of Africa where it kind of curves in. That's where all those countries are today. So these two figures represent the first man and the first woman in the creation myth or the origin story of the Sinufo people. They also symbolize the ideal social unit, a husband and a wife, according to Sinufo culture. And there are masks on the face and torso that identify the couple as accomplished members of society. They're pounded on the ground to provide rhythm for singing at funerals of important people. I guess that's why they have that really big bass on them, so that they can serve as pounders. The Sinufo consider transitions in life, going through initiation ceremonies, marrying and raising children, and contributing to the community's development and survival. All of those are important and might be ceremonies where these pounders would be used. They're not directly related to marriage, but they reinforce the importance of a male and female collaboration in the communal life of the Sinufo. They also use these as part of initiation ceremonies and funerals. So after the pounders are made by skilled carvers, they're always carved in pairs. They depict these elongated figures sitting on top of this high pedestal. Before a burial, the pounders are laid beside the body while other rituals are being performed for the deceased. So you can see they go through really every aspect of the transition of life and death. In a procession, while the body is being carried to a burial site, the elders carry the pounders and strike the ground in time to pounding drums, as if they were clearing a pathway for the deceased person. After the body is buried, someone secretly takes the pounders away from the grave, and they're stored away. After the burial, the Sinufo hold a night of celebration. It attracts musicians and masked performers from the region, and they do a dance in honor of the ancestors who have now departed. Do we have any questions about the rhythm instruments?
There's a question about the size of the pounders. Do you have approximate dimensions?
You know, I think they're about 2.5 to 3 feet tall.
Okay, thank you.
And with that, I think we will return back to Jim, who is going to be talking about a Greek vessel?
Thank you, Cindy. We are looking at this vessel is called a crater, which is a jar or vase from classical antiquity, having a large round body and a wide mouth, and was used for mixing wine and water. They were produced in workshops in Athens and other centers, and were painted with scenes from mythology, legends, and everyday life. This crater was not meant for everyday use. The Greeks generally poured their wine from plainer, unadorned vases. Decorated vessels, such as this one, were reserved for important occasions, like a symposium, which was an exclusive drinking party, fancy name for a drinking party, for men, and sometimes courtesans. Wives and other respectable citizen women were not included. Participants reclined on couches around the edges of a room, and a master of ceremonies filled their cups from a crater such as this one, which was set in the middle of the room. Music, poetry, storytelling, and word games accompanied the festivities. Cindy, I know you're a wine aficionado. Do you know how the ancient Greeks did their mixing, the ratios that they used? Well, they used three different kinds of mixing ratios. The first, can you everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Cindy, we have to unmute.
The first ratio was just for if you were just for general purposes. And the second, which was more wine, obviously, than water, was used for a little bit more festivities. And then for an event like this symposium, which was mostly men's and celebration, the ratio was 1-to-1. It was very strong and was meant to get everyone inebriated.
Thanks, Jim, for jumping in there while I was on mute. And I'm so glad you remembered everything that we went over in rehearsal.
No problem. But getting back, there was a serious side to the symposium besides just doing a lot of drinking. As described by Plato and other Greek philosophers, they also centered on debates about politics, ethics, philosophy, and literature. After the middle of the 6th century BCE, that's before Common Era, many of the finest vessels began to bear signatures of the artists who made them. This vase in particular is attributed to Christy Painter. Looking at this vase from left to right, we have a nude youth leaning on a staff wearing a chlamys, or a short oblong mantle or rectangular woolen blanket around his shoulder, and a tinea or a headband in his hair. Next is another nude male youth, except for the chlamys around his shoulder and tinea in his hair. His head is cast back as if looking at the young man behind him, as he plays a barbiton or a stringed instrument similar to a lyre. The musician, as seen here, would hold it vertically and pluck the strings with a pick held in his right hand. According to Aristotle, the barbiton was designed purely for entertainment purposes. The fact that one of the musicians plays a barbiton in this particular crater suggests they are probably going to a symposium for pleasure and not to a religious or state-sponsored event. Next, an elatress, who is a courtesan in ancient Greece, who played the aulos, or a double-piped reed instrument similar to an oboe to provide entertainment, stands in profile to the right with the tinea on her head. She wears a chiton, which was the basic garment of ancient Greece. Her cheek is inflated as she plays the double aulos. And lastly, on the far right is a torchbearer. On the back of the crater, we see three draped youth possibly going to the symposium. The making of this vessel consisted of several steps. The first step was to remove any impurities found in the natural clay and then knead it, like dough, to remove any air bubbles and make it flexible. Potters constructed the vessel's body by placing the clay on a potter's wheel. When an apprentice turned the wheel by hand, the potter pulled the clay up into its desired shape. The handles were modeled separately and attached to the base by applying slip, which is a liquefied clay, to the joints. Painting was usually the job of a specialist. Today, most people tend to regard painters as more elevated than potters. But in ancient Greece, the potters owned the workshops and employed the painters. Art historians refer to the pigment applied to the clay surface as a glaze. But the black areas that you see are neither a pigment nor a glaze, but a slip of finely sifted clay that was painted on and was of the same rich red-orange color as the clay of the pot. Firing of the crater consisted of a three-phase process. The first, or oxidizing phase, turned both the pot and the slip, which had been painted on, the color red. During the second, or reducing phase, the potter shuts off the oxygen supply to the kiln, and that ends up turning both the pot and slip black. In the final, or reoxidizing phase, the pot's coarser material reabsorbs oxygen and becomes red again, while the smoother silica-laden slip remains black. It's a beautiful crater. I would love to have gone to a symposium at the time. I wouldn't mind a little drink now and again. Christine, any questions?
No, we don't have any questions, but that was a really thorough explanation of the potting process. Thank you, Jim.
No problem, Christine. Next, Frank Shen will be talking a little bit about different ancient cultures and some current times. Frank?
Thank you, Jim. I'll be introducing three artworks in the DIA that are about harps, that is the pluck string musical instruments. Our brief journey will start in Egypt and go on to China and end up in France. Okay, here you're looking at a relief which is carved out of limestone. It's not too big, it's about 18 by 14 inches only, and not very thick either. It's about 1.5 inch. Now it's dated between 1350 and 1300 before the Common Era, BCE, and that will put us in the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history. Now, here you see that the musician is playing a arched harp. And even though it's ancient, it's already a well-developed instrument with a very large sound body at the bottom. And there you can also see that there are 8 tuning pegs, indicating there's probably 8 strings. Now, the strings are not visible, but they were probably once added in paint. Here, although we can't really see if the harpist is blind or not blind, in general, the musicians were often depicted as blind in Egyptian relief carvings. That's because they play for the deities, and no human being is supposed to set their eyes. And the same goes with their kings, who are considered as deities too. Now, scholars also theorize that the musicians in these reliefs are either symbolically blind or they were actually blind. And of course, this musical job certainly suited them. Now, the harp very likely originated in ancient Egypt as far back as in 3000 BCE. Now, we already found tomb paintings showing figures playing the harp, usually to accompany their storytelling or religious chants or singing songs. In this particular relief, you can see that there are actually 7 columns of hieroglyphics. Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Jim. There's altogether 7 of these. And most likely these are the words for the song that he's playing. Okay, now we do have a translation of that, which you can find on DIA's website on this object. Next, we'll go 1400 years later to China. Now, this is a set of earthenware figures that were funerary items, dated back to the 7th century, and which would put us in the Chinese Sui dynasty, which is a very short dynasty just before the very well-known Tang dynasty or the Tang dynasty. Now, in Chinese culture, it is quite believed that one should have available in the afterlife what one enjoys in real life. So even today, offerings of even paper cars and paper iPhones can become funerary offerings. Here, apparently, the deceased was accustomed to be entertained by musicians, and so his family had these made for him for his afterlife. Jim, next slide, please. Now, these figurines are not very large. They're just 7 3/4 inches high and about 3 inches wide. Okay, looking at them close up, you can see that their hairstyles are all the same, and it's very typical of the women from that era, the Sui Tang era. These would have been painted with brightly colored glazes that have now completely faded. The women's gestures, even without their instruments, can suggest what instrument each is holding. So let's take another look at all 12 in our display. Next slide, please. Now, here we're looking at all of them, all 12 of them. Let's start from the first row, from the left. Yes, Jim, we start there. Now, if you can see that this is not a musician at all, but really a dancer with her long sleeves flapping, which is a very typical dance move. Next to her is a woman playing a vertical instrument, okay, a bamboo flute. Then next one is playing a pan flute, which most of us are familiar with. After that is an instrument, the Chinese instrument called a pipa. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Next one in the front row, all the way to the right, is another dancer. So we have 2 dancers and 3 musicians in the first row. Now going backwards a little bit, again starting from the left, is another musician playing a vertical flute. Okay, and you see, I just mentioned that there are 2 of them, and they can be playing different flutes. Next to her is another pipa player. The next one, moving on, is playing a set of cymbals. And to the right in the second row, that is a harp player, and I'll talk more about that later on. Finally, the 3 standing up at the back, they are not musicians at all, but singers who are keeping rhythm by clapping their hands. So you can see that this is not just a musical orchestra, but actually an entire entertainment troupe. Next slide, please. Well, here I'm showing 3 particular ones: the pipa, top left, and then the vertical bamboo flute, and then the harp. Now, the Chinese words there are the Chinese names for these, which are not the same. Okay. Now, the pipa is an instrument that originated from India, eventually came to China, became the pipa, and of course, it went on to culturally being adapted into the Japanese as the biwa, and then Koreans as biwa. Now, pipa is a instrument that has been continuously used in the Chinese orchestra even to today. Next,
Frank, may I interrupt for just a second?
Sure.
I remember during our rehearsal, you were generous enough to show us from your collection of musical instruments, your own pipa. Do you think you'd be willing to show that to our audience today?
Oh, sure. Okay, sure. Yes. Yeah. Let me see. Here's an actual pipa. Okay, so it's pretty big and pretty heavy. Okay.
It's bigger than we might think. It's great that you were able to show that to us.
Oh yeah, I've been playing that since I was 14 years old. So. Now, moving on to the vertical bamboo flutes, there's actually two kinds of bamboo flutes called dongxiao or bili. Bili is kind of getting out of date and it's no longer being played anymore. We can tell how different they are by the way that the fingering, whether it's the right hand is up or the left hand is up. Okay, and finally, of course, let's get back to the harp. The harp is called konghao, and as you can see, even these paintings that I'm showing here are from the Ming Dynasty, which is 1,000 years later than these figurines. And so even 1,000 years later, the same harp is being played, but now is no longer in the Chinese orchestra. Okay, next slide, please. Now we move on to the harp. This is a harp you are seeing. It's made by Renaud and Chatelain, who are French instrument makers located in Paris, France. What you see here is that it is really also what is called a pedal harp. You can see at the bottom there are 5 pedals, 3 on this side and then 2 at the back. It has some beautiful decorations, including this harmonic curve and also some flowery decoration. Now, this one has 38 strings. A modern harp, concert harp, will have 47 strings. The interesting thing about this harp is also where they came from and how they got to the DIA. The harp was originally belonged to Anna Thompson Dodge. Now, Anna Dodge is the wife of Horace E. Dodge. Of course, those of us in Detroit will know that Horace Dodge and his brother were the ones who formed the Dodge Motor Car Company, which eventually became the Chrysler Dodge, and later on becomes the Stellantis Motor Car Company. Now, Mrs. Dodge was a devotee of French culture, including music and instruments, and she modeled her home is called Rose Terrace, which is in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. On the Petit Trianon, which of course is the Petit Trianon is the palace that Marie Antoinette has her residence. So it was popular that in those early 20th century that the wealthy homes will have a dedicated music room. So Mrs. Anna Dodge will have a music room. And when she passed away in 1970, she donated the entire collection to the DIA after she passed away. Okay, and that's it. Cindy, you're next.
Thanks, Frank. So we're moving on to another stringed instrument, not quite as sophisticated maybe as the ones that Frank was talking about. Now we're going to talk about the banjo. And no, Frank, I don't have one behind me in my music collection to show everyone. I don't play the banjo. So this painting is by William Sidney Mount. He's an American painter, musician, composer, and an inventor. And this painting is quite large. It's 3.5 feet wide and about 2 feet tall. You know, when I first looked at it, when we were starting to go through our selections for our presentation, I had no idea that it was such a large painting. Anyway, he created depictions of everyday American life. And they usually would include groups of people gathering together in a kind of a relaxed way, as you can see, in a really rustic environment. They were usually dancing to music that was being played by, more humble kinds of musicians, like the one you see in this painting. And I think, honestly, the most important sentence that I got out of all of our training regarding this painting the banjo player, in the 1800s, it was a time in America when there were many kinds of music and dance that were kind of coming together and melding together from all the immigrants who were coming into this country. They were teaching each other music, teaching each other songs, their own dances from their homeland and their former countries. And so the birth of American music came into its own during this time, and it was really an amalgam of the music that came from, from Europe and overseas. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next, Jim. So we have a sketch here, and it's courtesy of our DIA Conservation Lab. I'm assuming that when they did an X-ray of this painting, they probably saw that there were some contour lines underneath, or under painting or sketch. And we can see there are other figures. So we have the banjo player on the left. We have two dancers up on the right. And then we have the suggestion of another musician kind of in the center bottom. Okay, go ahead. So that tells us that this painting was most likely unfinished. He started it, he probably intended to have more figures. And most of the other paintings we see by Mount will have a group of people as opposed to just one. So that kind of points us to the idea that this was unfinished. So as I said, he was what we consider a genre painter. He was painting, rural scenes. And if we can move to the next, I think we'll talk about, yes. So here he is with his invention. He called this violin the cradle of harmony. And he wanted to invent a violin that had less moving parts and would be easier to produce, so that it would be more accessible to people who were of lesser means. Up until this point, to buy a violin and own an instrument, it was pretty costly. So it was really his intention that he could create something that could be owned by the masses. So you can see it's made from maple and spruce, and it lives at the Long Island Museum of American Art, which brings us to the fact that he lived in that area, and most of his paintings chronicle the life of Long Island. If we can go to the next, please. So here we have a photographic portrait of the dapper William Sidney Mount by Matthew Brady. When he was only 7 months old, he almost died, and they really were preparing to have a burial for him. And his aunt somehow saw some little tiny trickle of life in him, and she made them stop the funeral arrangements, and she actually was able to, with her tender care, bring him back to good health. After his own father died, he went to live with this aunt and her husband, and that's where his love of music came from, because his uncle was an established composer, playwright, poet. So from him, he learned to play musical instruments, and his uncle actually really inspired his passion for music. So as I said, he started with these kind of historical, we'll call them historical today, but these rural genre paintings. And then he also moved on to what we call posthumous mourning portraits. So what do I mean by that? Well, it was a pretty common practice at this time. If you lost a member of your family, you would commission a portrait to be painted of them so that you would have a keepsake to remember them by. And we do have, there are accounts of people who kept a record of what they paid. And so we know that William Sidney Mount charged $15 for a posthumous portrait. Doesn't sound like a lot of money then, but it definitely kept him alive as an artist and was able to help him pay the bills. So with that, I will ask if there are any questions.
We do not at this time, Cindy. So
all right,
we'll just
with that
keep moving along here.
We'll move on.
Thanks, Cindy. I know we have an example or two of the posthumous paintings, and they were oftentimes they were done of young children that
yes,
the parents would have painted to remember their children who passed, with the mortality rate at the time.
The one I was referring to, where the person actually wrote down what they paid for it, and we have a real document that states it. It was of a child. They commissioned to have a child's portrait painted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Our next piece is, we're going all the way back to 1620. And this is a great example of a pietra dura cabinet from the city of Florence, which the DIA was fortunate enough to acquire in 1994. The word petri dura comes from the Italian words petri for stones and dura for hard or hard stones. And it is a term used for the inlay technique whereby artists taking extremely small pieces of colored stone, which are then cut into different shapes and assembled together so precisely that the contact between each stone is practically invisible. Stability is achieved by grooving the undersides of the stones so that they interlock rather like a jigsaw puzzle. They are then glued to a slate substrate, with everything being held in place by a frame which surrounds it. Many different colored stones, particularly varieties of marble, were used, along with semi-precious and even precious stones. It is an extremely labor-intensive art technique. This cabinet was made in the Italian court of the Medici family, around, as I mentioned, 1620. During this time, the Medicis were the rulers of Florence and the most powerful family in the region of Tuscany, Italy. Their family ruled for over 200 years, resulting in Florence becoming one of the major courts in all of Europe. They were famous for their patronage of the arts, music, and literature. The Medici family were the first to create workshops or schools for the various art mediums such as painting, sculpture, metalwork, and in this case, pietra dura. So let's take a look at the central door of the cabinet. Although this cabinet was created in 1620, it references a famous Greek and Roman myth, the scene of Orpheus, who had the ability to charm all living things and even stones with his musical abilities. The story describes that the sweetness of his voice and his ability to play the lyre was so beautiful that even savage beasts would stop to listen to him. He is said to have been born with the gift of music and could mesmerize all who listened to him, man and beast alike. Known in both Greek and Roman mythology, Orpheus was a popular subject matter in both paintings and sculptures. The fronts of the other drawers contain images of a variety of animals. The Medicis collected domestic animals as well as a wide variety of live animals from distant lands. They had their own private zoo. The cabinet has 18 drawers in total, each decorated with a different animal, including 3 more drawers behind the Orpheus panel. The stones came from all over the world, indicating the Medici's far-reaching trade practices. Artists used the natural veining of the stones to represent the physical qualities of the animals they depicted, leopard having its spots in there. It would have taken several craftsmen up to a year to have completed this cabinet. Christine, any questions?
No, Jim, I know in the past we've talked a little bit about the Medici's having a zoo in their backyard. Wouldn't that be something, like walk out in your backyard and have
Exactly.
lions or animals from Africa back there, or a camel?
Right.
But I was thinking, like, perhaps maybe some of these animals they never did see.
Maybe. Like, I don't know how they could have brought an elephant, for example, or a large, maybe a large camel, but some of them would have been, probably they just had heard about them and they were able to create these. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the artists who made this never actually saw an elephant or some other type of animal.
Yeah, and don't we see that so often in artworks, that when artists try to create an animal, but they haven't seen it before. So sometimes it looks a little like squat, or not, the proportions aren't quite right. So yeah, I'm curious about that myself.
Yeah. We're fortunate enough to have in the Detroit area one of the finest zoos, in my opinion, and the United States, the Detroit Zoo, which enables children and adults alike to be able to come and see these animals from all over the globe. It's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And to note, too, we're a conservation and rehabilitation teaching center.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a good zoo.
It's a wonderful zoo. Cindy, would you mind talking a little bit about this? This is somewhat of an unusual, is it a photograph or a print? What is it? Let's start there.
It's a photograph, and the original negative was created, as you can see, in 1945, and then this particular one was reprinted in 2008, the one that's in the DIA's collection. And it's by Bill Rauhauser. He was a Detroiter, and some people say when you say the name Detroit, you can't disconnect it from Bill Rauhauser because he was such a big part of the Detroit area and also the DIA. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But when we were in rehearsal, we were all talking about trying to noodle out what was exactly in this photograph. We can see that there's a glass bowl, and then behind it there is a violinist. And then even behind that, there's some kind of a silhouette. And so we know that this was an overlay of probably more than one photograph. It's interesting, though, that silhouette, we all saw kind of different things in. One of us saw the profile of a woman's head. We could see kind of someone's foot at the bottom. So it's one of those things where it's kind of left up to the viewer. And I think maybe that's what makes it so interesting. Mm-hmm. So this came a little bit after a series that he did that was called the Object series. And the Object series were inspired by Marcel Duchamp, who did a series of work called Ready-Made Art. So when Rauhauser saw that, it made him think about trying to replicate that, not in paintings, but in photographs. So he would take very simple objects like a music stand or a hat, and he would put them against a background that gave you no clues as to time or place. So he made them kind of an eternal object. So once that object series was exhibited, then he went into his phase that was called the post-object series, and that's where this came from. And he started to dabble with really wild, high contrast, theatrical kind of images. And you can see this is really a combination of all three of those things. So anyway, every Sunday was music day at the Rauhauser home. The family's taste in music ran the gamut from classical to jazz and experimental music. And his career, Bill's career, coincided with the Beat era, which was a movement that centered on street music and jazz. He believed that understanding culture and music was crucial to making meaningful photographs. He said 2/3 of an artist's education should be history and literature. If you don't have that, you'll miss the shot. You can't say the name of Bill Rauhauser without Detroit attached to it. He was Detroit. He took thousands of photographs in and around this city and probably hundreds within the confines of the DIA inside the museum. Many of his most famous photographs are of people just sitting having a cigarette in Kresge Court. I'm going to he started out his life as an engineer, and he got his first taste of photography as art, and pretty soon he realized that his hobby was going to become his life. So I have a quote from him. It says, "I started when the city was just about at the height of its glory. After the war, it was the arsenal of democracy. We know that the automotive companies all kind of had to retrofit to create tanks and vehicles for the war effort. Everybody knew Detroit. It was the automobile center of the world," he said, "a great city. My photographs have become sort of important. It shows the period where the Detroit city started to fade away in a sense." So his start was in 1933 when he bought a cheap 39-cent, it was called a Univex camera. And he bought it from a magazine ad, and probably in a comic book, I would imagine. He later traded his stamp collection for an Argus Model A 35mm camera, which at the time was manufactured in Ann Arbor. So that was his first professional camera. Later on, he was attending a night class, and that was when he knew in the first 10 minutes that photography was what he had to do. With the support of his wife, Doris, who continued as a kindergarten teacher, he quit his day job. Nice wife. His lifelong association with the DIA began when he encouraged the museum director, Willis F. Woods, to start a photography department. He later donated 343 of his street photographs to the DIA, and he also took on the task of organizing the photography department at the DIA at a later date. So he really had quite a hand in what today we call the Prince Photographs, Prince Drawings and Photographs Department at the DIA. His work hung in many exhibitions at the DIA. A couple of them would have been in 1996, The Car and the Camera, which was a centennial of automobile manufacturing. In 2013, which was, more contemporary, he did Motor City Muse. In 2014, he was named as the 2014 Kresge Eminent Artist, and they created a catalog of his work to honor him in that way. And the same year, I think this is an interesting little tidbit, he was invited to sign one of the beams at the Scarab Club, and his signature is near those of Margaret Bork White, the famous woman photographer, Tony Spina, and Balthasar Korab, who were both Detroit photographers as well. Before we open it up for questions, I just have two more quotes I want to give you about or from Bill Rawhauser. He said, "Photography is about being there, being ready, and being lucky. If you come to a fork in the road, take it. That's what I did. I took the road less traveled." Christine, do we have any questions?
We don't, but I'm remembering we had a short photography exhibition of his work some years ago, and our curator, Nancy Barr, had them out for some time. And it's fun to see them because since they have to be protected, they're very seldom on view, and they mainly live in storage. But
yeah, this one's kind of unusual. It's large. I think if I remember right, it's like 11 by 19. So it's, for a photograph, it's a pretty big one. It was printed on a larger format.
Yeah, and it's not on view. Thank you.
And this is Bill Rawhauser, and I think this is shortly before he passed away. But he did a lot of self-portraits, and there is one that's in the DIA's collection as a print of him standing in his mid-century modern home with one of those starburst clocks behind him, and the real sleek. I mean, he was a dapper guy. He was a really cool guy. At any rate, our collection and our connection with Bill Rawhauser, has really been a magnificent one for the DIA as an institution. So with that, we'll move on. Thanks.
Thanks, Cindy. This is a painting by George Lukes, and it's called Three Top Sergeants. And George Lukes played a key role in the development of a new approach to realism in early 20th century American art. His paintings and drawings depicted the gritty realism of everyday real life, such as the common workers and street urchins of New York City. His work celebrated democracy and the common man. Though his work was a new approach to realism, he was not adverse, or shall I say opposed, to artificially creating or constructing a scene, as in this painting called Three Top Sergeants. According to a first-hand account by Walter Vandenberg, the model who posed as the singer in the painting, he and two other artists, all living in the same building as Lukes, stopped by the artist's apartment late one night. During the course of the evening, Lukes was inspired to paint the three men. He handed a guitar to Cy King, a flute to someone who was only known as Burley, and an art magazine to Vandenberg to serve as a music book while he appears to be singing. Lukes captured the scene with slashing brushstrokes and worked in a quick, free, and animated style. His technique infused the painting with a sense of liveliness and immediacy, which was a notable feature in his other works on the subject of music and dance. According to Vandenberg, Lukes completed the painting in 3 hours that night, adding only the guitar strings the next day. George Lukes' art dealer brought Clyde Burrows, the director of the DIA at the time, by Lukes' apartment that very next morning, where Burrows immediately bought this painting and shipped it back to Detroit. The title of the painting, like its subject matter, is also somewhat misleading, as the name top sergeant is a more common term for a first sergeant in the United States military. The sitters in the painting were not top sergeants, but actually illustrators for the New Yorker magazine. The Ashcan School, which George Lukes was a member of, was a progressive group of American painters and illustrators, originally comprised of John Sloan, George Burroughs, William Glackens, and Robert Henri. They believed that art should portray the everyday, including even the harsh realities of life, especially in New York City, and rejected officially sanctioned art, which they said was fenced in with tasseled ropes and weighed down with bronze plates. They generally painted gritty, poor urban scenes in a spontaneous, unpolished style. They were all urban realists who supported Robert Henri's credo, art for life's sake rather than art for art's sake. The term Ashcan School came about when either a staff member from the socialist magazine titled The Masses objected to their work, which he felt was filled with pictures of ash cans or trash cans and girls hitching up their skirts on Horatio Street. Or it possibly came from a disparaging art critic on a drawing by the artist George Billows titled Disappointments of the Ash Can, in which he depicted 3 vagrants scrutinizing the contents of an ash can. George Lukes began his working life as a vaudeville comedian. Later in life, he worked as an illustrator and drew comic strips for the New York World. He was volatile, unpredictable, a braggart, and was hard drinking. He drew and painted scenes of New York's lower class life, though he often ignored the reality of poverty and overcrowding, favoring to focus on the romance of New York City's teeming humanity and its American spirit. Lukes was found dead in a doorway after a barroom brawl at the age of 66. And with that, I think we'll move right on to Cindy. You've got a very different piece of art. It's tell us about it. It's actually what is this?
I think we could use something a little bit uplifting after that last sentence that you died in the doorway.
But just tells you about the type of man he is, often by the way they end it.
He was a ribald kind of a guy, wasn't he?
I agree.
So this is a sound suit by Nick Cave, and Nick Cave is well known for creating multiple sound suits, and the DI is very fortunate to have one in our collection. So the reason he got started with creating these, I guess I'll call it an outfit. It's kind of inspired by, I believe, African outfits that are used for the masquerade, which of course, he was aware of. So what originally kind of propelled him into creating the first sound suit, he lives and works in Chicago. And his very first sound suit was created as a reaction to the beating of Rodney King. If you remember that, it was in the news. Cave was very upset and went to Grant Park in Chicago. And he began just walking around and assembling twigs, I guess maybe sort of as a therapeutic kind of thing to maybe try and relax, himself from that reaction to the Rodney King beating. So the sounds of the twigs, the sounds that the twigs made while he was moving around created noise, which he felt helped mask his own identity. At the time, he felt society regarded African American men as disposable. And he thought that by creating a full body masked outfit like this in the African tradition, He was able to mask the wearer's identity, giving them freedom from things like race, gender, discrimination, and prejudice. He's created many sound suits. All of them are based on the criteria of sculpture, sound, and anonymity. The wearer's face is always covered. So this particular suit is covered in buttons, and they're attached with plastic price tag connectors so that the buttons can kind of wiggle and move. So when the dancer's dancing, all of the buttons make their own kind of music or sound. I have a quote here from him. He describes the experience of wearing one of his sound suits as, he says, once I put it on, I have to settle with myself. I don't move right away, not for a while. I've got to reach a point where I surrender my identity and it's no longer present. A wearer can dance the suit, creating the sounds of whatever is attached to it, in this case, buttons. And he likes to emphasize in these pieces how freeing it can be to dance in a sound suit, free of society's bias, free to feel a new sense of self while you're wearing the piece. And he also has a Detroit connection. He attended Cranbrook in Bloomfield Hills. And the other part of this whole sound suit wearing dance is that he was at one time also in the troupe of the Alvin Ailey Dancers in New York City. So he's, I guess you could say he's a multimedia artist, not only by creating art, but also performing art. So with that, I will go back to Christine and ask if we have any questions about Nick Cave and his sound suit.
No specific questions, but in addition to graduating from the graduate program at Cranbrook, they did have a retrospective of his work recently. And then also, in addition to that, I was recently in New York City, and there is a huge area down in the subway where he was hired to create a mosaic installation. And so there are sound suits all across one of the walls down in the subway. And when you're walking to your train, you can see his work.
You know, it's interesting that we have this photographic portrait of him at the end, and thanks, Jim, for putting it up. He does not like to have his picture taken, and there aren't many photographs of him. And we found this on Wikimedia Commons, and it does state there that this was a self-portrait that he took. He took this photograph, but he doesn't allow, no one knows what he looks like unless they actually meet him. So this whole idea of masking his identity follows through, even in his everyday life. He really doesn't want anyone to see his visage or what he looks like. So with that, I think we'll go back to Jim to wrap it up.
Thanks, Cindy. Our last piece is titled Roland Hayes, Portrait of a Singer, and is by the African-American artist Reginald Gammon. Our painting was done in 1983 and is one piece from Gammon's body of work on music by African Americans. Roland Hayes was a lyric tenor and is considered the first African American male concert artist to receive international fame. He performed in New York, Chicago, and Boston. He also performed throughout Europe and in London, and he even performed before the King of England. He sang several times with the Boston Symphony Orchestra with much acclaim. He was born in 1887 on a plantation in Georgia, where his parents were tenant farmers. His mother had been previously enslaved on the same plantation. As a youth, his singing abilities were quickly recognized as he performed in his church choir. He grew up singing African American spirituals with his family. And at the age of 12, Hayes discovered a recording of Enrico Caruso. After singing and teaching Negro spirituals, he went on to study at Fisk University in Nashville. In spite of ongoing racism in the United States and abroad, Hayes went on to become a well-known and successful lyric tenor. I'd like to end today's presentation on Picturing Music by playing a short excerpt from the Christian spiritual song Little Boy, which was composed and is being performed by Roland Hayes. So hold on. And thank you everyone for coming.
Little boy, how old are you?
Can't you just see him singing from the painting this song?
Boy, how old are you? Say, little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old.
And with that, I'll turn it back to Cindy, who will wrap things up. Cindy?
Jim, thanks for embedding that soundbite from, one of his musical performances. It really brings it to life. And as you said, when you're looking at that portrait, you could almost imagine those notes coming right out of his mouth. So as just a little wrap up, I think all of us can agree that music was and is an important part of many cultures, and that music can tell us a lot about the person or the group who created it. I think we've tried to be able to represent and illustrate that to you today. So I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to remind you that the DIA is open, and we invite you to plan your visit by reserving a ticket via the DIA website. We're open Tuesday through Thursday, 9 to 4, Friday, 9 to 9, and Saturday and Sunday from 10 to 5. Our current exhibitions include Van Gogh's Artistic Roots, The Hague School, and French Realism. That will continue through January 29th. It's in the Impressionism Gallery Suite off of Rivera Court. Conscious Response, Photographers Changing the Way We See. That's in the Schwartz Galleries. And then we have Van Gogh in America on deck to come October 2nd. So make sure you get your tickets in advance because it's going to be a really crowded exhibition. Thank you to Ian Repnicki, our Community Engagement Manager for Macomb County, and to Sharon Harrell, who you didn't see on screen today, but who was with us, also helping to produce. She's our Community Engagement Manager for Wayne County. And then Chris Mark, who is our Volunteer Development Manager. And of course, thanks to Jim and to Frank. I really enjoyed doing this presentation today with the two of you. Next Thursday on August 18th, please join us for Van Gogh's Artistic Roots. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.